around to various parts of the country, and also, and all the kids that came forward described incredible abuse. Abuse by very sadistic pedophiles, and Alicia Owen was one of them. And
these were orgy scenes that were orchestrated by adults, but included clearly underage boys and girls. There are all kinds of weird sexual practices and homosexual events, bisexual events that these people reported.
Yeah, so Gary Caradori recorded 20 hours of victim testimony, and the victims repeatedly backed each other up on numerous perpetrators and numerous events. And the senators were shocked that law enforcement, after the Senate subcommittee started investigating the child abuse allegations, law enforcement, including the FBI and the Omaha Police Department, said that they'd investigated the child abuse allegations after the Senate subcommittee started to investigate the child abuse allegations, and that they had no substance. But really, there hadn't been an investigation. Again, law enforcement was, for the most part, lying. And but then Gary Caradori videotaped the victims, and the senators, these Nebraska senators, sent the videotapes to the U.S. Attorney for Nebraska and also Nebraska's Attorney General. So you had empirical proof of this pedophile network, considering that these kids completely, very much corroborated each other.
And you go into great detail in the book showing that their stories did match up, at least in the most essential elements.
Yes, and ultimately that caused some of the toothpaste to come out of the tube. Both the federal and state law enforcement had to act now because they realized that the Senate subcommittee was going to expose this network. So 2 grand juries were formed in Nebraska, a federal grand jury and a state grand jury that was to look into the child abuse allegations. And ultimately, both grand juries declared that children hadn't been transported, that there wasn't any child abuse whatsoever. And in my book, I have the sealed grand jury testimony and most of the sealed grand jury documents from the state grand jury. And in my book, I show what a travesty of justice that entire grand jury was. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the grand jury format, but grand jurors are just regular citizens who are called into jury duty, and then they've been put on grand juries. And it's really up to the special prosecutor who's appointed to a grand jury to decide what evidence he deems should be shown to the grand jurors he deems is relevant. So special prosecutors are in a very, very pivotal position to sway grand juries because they choose the witnesses that are called. They choose the evidence that's shown to the grand jurors. And in this case, this grand jury, the state grand jury that declared that the child abuse allegations were a carefully crafted hoax and indicted Alicia Owen on 8 counts of perjury, and another kid who wouldn't recant on 3 counts of perjury. In the book, I show what a travesty of justice that grand jury was. And it was imperative, and then the state, or the federal grand jury also indicted Alicia on 8 counts of perjury, and I show how corrupt, exactly how the state grand jury was co-opted, and I show basically that what happened with the state grand jury essentially happened with the federal grand jury. So it was essential that they nail Alicia Owen for perjury. She was the first kid that was tried. The FBI came in and got the other victims to recant their abuse. And the victims were told if they went on with this story, as Alicia was told, that they would be charged with perjury. So it was essential that the state nailed Alicia Owen for perjury because it would send a resounding signal to other victims who had been told, if you stick with this story, you're going to jail for perjury. But also it would sanctify the grand jury report that said that there wasn't any child abuse whatsoever.
And the authorities had already flipped this victim named Troy Boner, who changed his story about 18 different times, and was clearly an unreliable witness. But they conveniently used what they found useful from his modified testimony and ignored his lack of credibility and the way his story had changed over time?
Well, anytime you have the FBI coming in and saying that Troy Bonner is telling the truth and Troy supposedly passed an FBI polygraph, people want to believe that the FBI is going to go after child molesters. I mean, people really want to believe that. I wanted to believe that. So it's very difficult to believe, or it's very hard to believe that the FBI would be covering up child abuse. But in this particular situation, the FBI was definitely covering up child abuse. And the FBI went to bat for Troy Bonner and said that he was very honest and he was being sincere. Troy would later say that threats from the FBI in an affidavit and also in other milieus, he would say that threats from the FBI and other types of threats eventually forced him to recant his abuse and testify against Alicia Owen.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to come back because I understand the background you just offered, but I want people to understand the police chief, Wadman, and his role in this and how he was able to wiggle out of any culpability.
Well, at least one of there were several perjury indictments against Alicia. There were 8, and one of her perjury indictments was she said that she had an affair with the police chief, Robert Wadman, and that he had actually fathered her child. And that was one of her perjury indictments. And another perjury indictment was that she had been pandered out to a judge in Nebraska. Mm-hmm. And she also fingered other prominent people, too, and she was indicted for that. So she was indicted for fingering a number of prominent people in not only her abuse, but taking part in the pedophile network. And that's what she was found guilty of. And in my book, I really go into her trial, and I show just how corrupt and perfidious her trial was.
Yeah, it's ugly. It's really ugly. And the judge, Case was his name, just was relentless in allowing the government to object to everything that Rosenfeld, the attorney at the time, attempted to do. And, Rosenfeld was prevented from aggressively questioning the government witnesses, and then the government just ripped Alicia and her defenders up when they were in the box.
Yes, and then FBI agents lined up to testify against Alicia and other law enforcement people. And also, there was a lot of jury manipulation. I get into that in the book, too. There was false evidence planted in the jury room that had never been introduced into the trial. And then the night, Alicia's history was one of the longest criminal trials in Nebraska state history. The state spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. Alicia was indicted when she was 21, and the state spent hundreds of thousands of dollars convicting this girl in Nebraska of perjury. I mean, the state has spent far more money on capital offenses many, many times. I mean, it was imperative. All stops were pulled out to convict Alicia Owen. So this cover-up, I mean, it's kind of funny. The cover-up of this nationwide pedophile network ultimately fell on the shoulders of a kid in Nebraska who just refused to recant her abuse.
Yeah.
It's kind of an amazing story.
Now, tell us about the Washington connections here, Nick Bryant, and what Larry King was able to, who he was able to cultivate, who he was apparently providing young girls and young boys to for sexual exploitation.
Well, the Franklin story really doesn't make any sense without the Washington, D.C. Side of it, because why would the Department of Justice and the FBI and Nebraska's judiciary spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to prosecute a girl that wouldn't recant her abuse? That doesn't make a lot of sense. But you really have to look at the Washington, D.C. angle to understand what the feds were protecting. And the feds were protecting a lot of very powerful people who were actually compromised. Craig Spence, according to a number of sources, Craig Spence was Lawrence E. King's partner in pedophilic pandering. And Craig Spence was also a Republican power broker. He was in Washington, D.C., and he had a house that was in a very ritzy section of Washington, D.C., and Craig Spence, by his own admission, was a CIA asset, and then I did get other people to corroborate the fact that Craig Spence was, in fact, a CIA asset. And he had parties at his house, and the parties would basically start out, Spence's parties were like a who's who of Washington elite. Congressmen would go to Spence's parties, upper echelon members of the Reagan administration, upper echelon members of what would become the Bush administration, upper echelon officials at the CIA, upper echelon officials in the Department of Justice, all would attend Spence's parties. And the parties would generally start out as a straight political cocktail party, where you would have power brokers sitting around drinking cocktails, discussing events. And then at a certain point, you would ultimately, someone at about 10 o'clock or about 11 o'clock, someone would fire up a joint or break out some coke, and then the people that were freaked out by that would split, and the people that wanted to stick around, that were lubricated on alcohol, would be provided with whatever they wanted to be provided with.
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking here at the section on Washington, D.C., and you say several former associates of Spence said his house was bugged and had a secret two-way mirror. He had attempted to ensnare visitors into compromising sexual encounters that he could then use as leverage. Do you have any testimony that he actually did use this as leverage to control people or manipulate them, or to help cover up the case in Nebraska?
Well, yes, in the book I talk about various people that had been compromised by Spence. It's very difficult to name names in a lot of situations because everybody that was affiliated with the network, and we're talking about the kids and then the people that played instrumental roles in the network, were all taken down. I mean, the kids were generally from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and dysfunctional families. And then they were turned on to drugs at a very young age, and they became drug addicts and molested. And then the people that were part of the ring, like the blackmail photographer who I interviewed, and then someone who ran the largest escort service in Washington, D.C., who provided, spent about $20,000 a month on escorts, and at his escort service. And King and Spence, he said that King and Spence brought him into their enterprise, and this gentleman was fully aware of the blackmail equipment, and he said that Spence had told him that the blackmail equipment had been installed by the CIA, and Spence told reporters that the blackmail equipment in his house had been bugged, quote unquote, by a friendly intelligence agency. So there is some corroboration that the CIA was involved in Spence's blackmail operation. But yes, in the book I talk about Spence blackmailing some lower echelon people. I don't get into the upper echelon people because everyone associated with this on the dark side of this story is a felon. I mean, it's the kids. If a kid said if a kid comes forward and says I had Senator X molested me, well, it's that kid's word against Senator X, and this kid has been turned on to drugs at a very young age and repeatedly molested, and then at a certain point in puberty, this network just kind of spit the kid out like gum that's lost its flavor. So ultimately, it's really difficult. I mean, when I was writing the Franklin scandal, I wanted to avoid conjecture and surmise. So although the names of some unbelievably prominent politicians have come up as far as molesting children, it's very difficult because of this this network's built-in protective mechanism, which is that everyone that's affiliated with it has been compromised to one degree or another, whether they've compromised themselves or whether law enforcement has taken them down for various felonies. Mm-hmm. So it's when you've got the word of a felon or a drug addict against that of an exalted politician, it's like, as far as credibility goes, it's a first-round TKO.
Yeah.
So it's really, I found it very difficult to name names, but I do get into some of the people that Spence had blackmailed, and I demonstrate that Spence did have the blackmail equipment in his house. And I demonstrate also that Spence's parties were a veritable who's who of Washington elite and various power brokers, and also people in industry and also people in journalism. William Safire attended his parties. Ted Koppel attended his parties. This was a huge compromise operation, and I think that that's one of the reasons why Alicia had to be found guilty. I think that had this story blown up, I think the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush would have been jeopardized. And I also think of a very corrupt political system of where